Hey friends, tonight we're diving into the gritty, fascinating world of medieval peasants, the unsung survivors of some of the harshest winters in human history. These everyday legends didn't just endure, they adapted with clever tricks, stubborn grit, and a whole lot of heart. From stuffing cracks with straw to huddling like penguins before penguins were cool, their nightly battle against the cold is a story worth telling. Before we get into it, if you enjoy these deep dives into the past, go ahead and like the video and hit subscribe. But only if you genuinely vibe with what we're building here. Also, drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. I love seeing the mix of time zones and places that come together for these cozy history sessions. Alright, lights down, maybe a warm blanket, or the soft hum of a fan in the background. Let's set the mood. When you picture medieval times, your brain probably goes to knights jousting, goblets overflowing, or fairs with lute music and roasted meats. But for your average peasant, winter wasn't festive. Winter was survival mode. It wasn't a season. It was a yearly final boss battle. And spoiler alert, there were no cheat codes. Imagine this. You're tucked inside a hut made of mud, straw, and sheer optimism. The walls are so thin you could hear a bird cough from the forest. There's no glass in the window, just a hole with some stretched animal hide over it. And forget about central heating. The only temperature control was the fire in the hearth, which mostly served to toast your toes if you were lucky enough to be sitting right in front of it. Outside, the cold bites. Inside, slightly less bitey. Think of it as nature's version of room temperature, with a side of frostbite. And the nights? Oh, the nights. They were long, dark, and full of howling wind that slipped through every crack like an uninvited ghost. The fire would sputter and wheeze, trying its best, but honestly, it was hanging on just as hard as everyone else. If you were on the far side of the room, sorry, you might as well have been camping outside, minus the marshmallows, and the tent, and the dignity. Peasant homes didn't come with central heating or cozy corners. They came with frost-nipped toes and regret. And don't think clothing saved the day. There were no fur-lined parkas or goose-down comforters here. You had a couple of scratchy wool tunics, a cloak that smelled vaguely of wet goat, and the desperate hope that layering them would somehow transform you into a human radiator. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Beds? If you were lucky, you had a sack stuffed with straw and a few flattened rushes. If you were really lucky, that straw only had a few fleas. No quilts, no pillows, just you, some itchy bedding, and the persistent sense that medieval luxury was a lie. But let's be clear, the cold wasn't just a nuisance, it was lethal. Frostbite, hypothermia, and did they just freeze to death in their sleep were constant winter companions, especially for kids and the elderly. Every morning you woke up with all your fingers still attached was a small miracle. And that called for celebration, maybe with a slightly less frozen turnip for breakfast. Because surviving winter in medieval times wasn't about comfort. It was about sheer, stubborn endurance. You piled on every scrap of cloth you owned, snuggled up with the livestock for warmth, and prayed to wake up without icicles forming, in places icicles should never form. And you thought your apartment was drafty? If your window doesn't quite close and lets in a breeze, medieval peasants would laugh through chattering teeth. Their homes weren't just drafty, they were basically open-air wind tunnels with a slight mud coating. Most peasant houses were built using what historians generously call wattle and daub, which is a fancy way of saying weaved sticks smeared with mud, straw, and, yes, animal dung. Not for aesthetic reasons, dung was cheap, sticky, and surprisingly good at plugging gaps. So, points for resourcefulness? But even the most lovingly smeared walls didn't stand a chance against real winter weather. Wind found every crack, crevice, and moral weakness. It slipped inside like an uninvited guest, refused to leave, and made sure you never got too cozy. Roofs? Ah yes, those charming thatched roofs. They looked quaint in drawings, but in reality, after a few weeks of rain, snow, and wildlife invasions, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally dropped the odd squirrel onto your dinner. You weren't living in a house. You were surviving in a very leaky, hay-scented compromise. And windows? If they existed at all, they were laughably tiny, covered with stretched animal hide or a wooden shutter that barely closed. Natural light? Maybe. Insulation? Not a chance. Glass was so outrageously expensive back then that even the local lord, yes, the guy with the castle and the fancy hat, might have only had a single tiny pane in the whole manor. As for the peasants, they were just hoping the wind didn't rip the cowhide off their window mid-blizzard and send it flying into the next village. Expectations were low. Survival was the goal. And if the walls weren't already doing a poor enough job of keeping the cold out, the floors were more than happy to help it sneak in. You see, the average medieval peasant's floor wasn't made of wood or stone. It was dirt. Just plain, compacted earth. And when it rained or snowed, that dirt turned into mud. Slowly. From underneath. Congratulations. You now had an unintentional indoor swamp. Real estate listings might have called it a natural water feature, but no one was fooled. In winter, every step across your own floor felt like wading through a half-frozen marsh. Cold from above, cold from below, cold from inside your own walls. It was a full surround sound experience in suffering. But here's the thing. Medieval peasants weren't complainers. They were problem solvers, resourceful, slightly desperate. They stuffed moss into the cracks, jammed cloth into every drafty gap, and huddled together like human space eaters. Insulation? Nah. Just your cousin's body heat and the faint hope that no one rolled over too far in the night. Sometimes they'd smear the walls with sheep grease. Not for decoration, though who doesn't love a nice greasy sheen, but because it helped seal gaps. It was basically nature's caulk. If you were lucky, your house didn't smell like barnyard despair all the time. And when your entire home was held together by dung, mud, and hope, you learned to laugh, or at least chitter weakly through clenched, frostbitten teeth. But the cold didn't just attack from the sides. No, the most silent, sneaky enemy rose from beneath, the frozen earth itself. Floors were less floors and more ground, but slightly flatter. If someone had kindly tossed some straw or rushes across it, congratulations, you now had something between you and the soul-sapping chill of the underworld. Barely. That ground cold was ruthless. It crept through the straw, up through your feet, into your bones, and straight into your will to live. Drop anything on the floor in the middle of the night? It's gone. Frozen. Now part of the architecture. To fight back, some peasants piled thick layers of straw on the floor as insulation. If you were lucky, or sneaky enough to nab it from your neighbor's field under the cover of darkness, you might get enough to make it work, for a while. But straw flattened fast, grew mold even faster, and made every step sound like you were walking on a bowl of cornflakes. Rushes were the other option, Homes would lay them down, then just keep tossing fresh ones over the old, never bothering to clean out the decomposing layers beneath. Over time, these floors developed into a kind of medieval ecosystem. It was like carpet. If your carpet was damp, vaguely alive, and probably full of uninvited guests like fleas, mice, and other mystery creatures. As for beds, they didn't offer much of a break. Think wooden frame, topped with more straw or hay, and that's it. No mattresses, no feather toppers, no pillow top luxury. Just the rustic charm of scratchy straw poking into your back while you try to dream about not freezing to death. Forget cozy mattresses. Medieval peasants slept on beds that crackled, shifted, and poked at them like nature's version of a whoopee cushion. Comfort wasn't the goal. Tossing and turning wasn't a sign of insomnia. It was survival strategy. A desperate midnight shuffle to keep your blood moving and avoid waking up with one side of your body frozen stiff. The truth? Medieval peasants didn't beat the icy ground. They simply learned to exist slightly above it, like awkward birds perched on straw nests. A good night's sleep didn't mean sweet dreams. It meant waking up with all your limbs intact. And if you managed that, you were winning. Now, if there was a single true winter hero in a medieval home, it wasn't the sagging roof, the drafty walls, or even the stubborn layer of dung and moss trying its best to block the wind. Number it was the hearth. The hearth was the soul of the house, the gritty, smoky, stubborn heart that pulsed with heat, light, and the only thing standing between you and a slow, frosty demise. Forget mantles and fancy fireplaces. In a peasant's home, the hearth was a pit in the floor, maybe some rocks shoved together, with a few burning logs doing their best not to die out before you did. And chimneys? Not unless you lived in an actual castle. Instead, the smoke just lingered. It drifted around the room like it was looking for a place to settle, occasionally wandering out through a hole in the roof or squeezing through a crack in the wall. If it couldn't find a way out, into your lungs it went. Breathing wasn't great. Living to old age wasn't guaranteed. But on the upside, your fleas didn't last long in that level of indoor fumigation. Who needs bug spray when you've got passive smoke warfare 24/7? But the hearth wasn't just a heat source. It was the stove, the nightlight, the social hub. People gathered around it not just for warmth, but for stories, gossip, arguments, and that blank fire stare we all fall into when there's nothing else to look at. In winter, the fire was your entertainment, your hope, your literal lifeline, and keeping it alive was a mission. Letting the fire die overnight, that was practically a death sentence. There were no matches, no lighters. Reigniting a fire in the depths of winter meant flint, steel, fragile kindling, and a whole lot of frustrated whisper yelling at damp wood, while your fingers slowly went numb. So every member of the family had their role, watching the embers, feeding the flames, adding sticks, moss, dried peat, or, if you were truly blessed, a scrap of dry wood. It wasn't just a chore, it was a nightly war effort against the creeping cold that never really slept. The hearth didn't guarantee survival, but without it, survival was off the table. It sputtered, it smoked, sometimes it coughed more than it crackled. But that little patch of glowing coals was everything. It was defiance in the face of winter. It was the last line of defense. It was hope in flickering orange. Because in the medieval world, if there was one thing peasants feared more than disease, famine, or running out of ale, it was waking up to a dead fire No fire meant the cold came knocking, and it didn't knock politely. Lighters, dream on. If you wanted fire in the Middle Ages, you had to earn it. That meant smashing flint and steel together in the cold, praying one lonely spark would catch, and then nursing that spark like it was your only child. Because it was, in a way. Drop the ball, and it was back to freezing your fingers off in the dark while questioning your life choices. And if you needed motivation, cue the distant howl of a hungry wolf echoing through the night. So peasants got clever. They banked the fire. Not in a cozy, set it and forget it way. This wasn't medieval 401k. Fire banking meant carefully burying the glowing embers under a thick layer of ash right before bed. Ash, it turns out, is nature's sleepy time blanket. It insulated the coals just enough to keep them barely alive until morning. Done right? You could wander over at dawn, poke the pile, toss on some wood and poof, instant fire, no frostbite required. Done wrong? Well, let's just say your morning started with frozen regret and a lot of grumbling. But fire banking wasn't just a task. It was art, passed down like a family recipe with way higher stakes. Everyone had an opinion. Some swore by bone-dry ash. Others said a little dampness kept the coals happy. Some packed it tight like a coal burrito. Others let it breathe, like it was on spa day. Suggest a better technique, and you could spark a full-blown argument. Think medieval Twitter, but with fewer vowels and more sheep. Of course, even a perfectly banked fire wasn't safe. A gust of wind could sneak through a wall crack and snuff it out. Or, occasionally, a clumsy goat might take a midnight stroll straight into the hearth. Yes, that happened. That's why some families took shifts checking the coals overnight. An early version of creeping to the thermostat in your socks, except colder, darker, and with a slightly higher chance of being trampled by livestock. But even one surviving ember? That was a win. That ember meant warmth, cooking, life. It meant one more day not becoming a medieval popsicle. Now in those frigid nights, when the fire was gasping and the wind was doing its best ghost impression, there was one final foolproof source of warmth: each other. And if that meant sleeping elbow to elbow with your entire family, 3 neighbors, 2 pigs, and a goose named Harold, so be it. Privacy? Cute idea. Not a thing. On winter nights, survival meant forming a desperate pile of humans and animals, all mashed together like a medieval casserole, steamy, chaotic, and weirdly effective. The warmest corner of the house became the designated cuddle zone. Everyone wore whatever scraps of cloth they could find. Kids were tucked between adults, elders buried in the middle, and if Cousin Ethel showed up late, scoot over, there's always room. If you were lucky, you got the middle. If you weren't, you got the outside, the medieval equivalent of sleeping beside a walk-in freezer. And heaven help you if you rolled over during the night and booted someone into a draft. Accidentally shoved grandma into a cold spot. You just became a family legend. For all the wrong reasons. Even bedding was a team effort. One big straw mattress, or something pretending to be one, flattened by the nightly weight of generations. Was it soft? Number. Did it smell great? Also number. But in a battle against frostbite, you stopped caring around bedtime. Body heat wasn't a luxury, it was strategy. Some guides even suggested putting the strongest, warmest people on the outside like human thermal shields. Babies and elders, right in the center, tucked in tight like tiny royal embers. Because in the medieval winter, staying warm wasn't just an act of comfort, it was an act of solidarity. a shared struggle, and sometimes it was just a really awkward family sleepover with livestock. This wasn't just about surviving, it became a way of life. Huddled together night after freezing night, people did more than share body heat. They shared stories, songs, secrets whispered under wool blankets, and more than a few arguments about who had the coldest toes. Family bonding wasn't optional. It was embedded into the straw-packed floor. So next time your sibling steals the blanket or your dog hogs the bed, just remember, at least you're not wedged between a snoring uncle and a judgmental goat that keeps staring like it knows your secrets. And speaking of winter roommates, modern flatmates have nothing on medieval house guests. Enter the livestock. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens, basically anything that had a pulse and produced heat, got a golden ticket indoors. This wasn't a quirky rural aesthetic. It was survival strategy 101. Every animal in the house meant one more barrier against frostbite, one more breath fogging up the icy air. And as a bonus, if your goat was sleeping beside you, it was slightly less likely to disappear into someone else's stew pot by morning. Security system and space heater in one smelly, head-butting package. By nightfall, the peasant home transformed into a living, mooing furnace. Chickens claimed the corners. Pigs stretched out wherever they pleased, snorting like they owned the place. Cows leaned lazily against the walls, chewing cud like bored roommates with nothing better to do. It was crowded. It was chaotic. It was pungent. Ever been stuck in a packed car with someone who's gone 3 days without deodorant? Now replace the person with a pig. Add mud. Take away the windows. Congratulations. You've unlocked the medieval winter experience. And the smell? Oh, the smell. By spring, the house had absorbed months of damp, dung, and dander. It didn't need a scent diffuser. It was the scent. But peasants developed a selective nose, a survival skill nearly as vital as firebanking. Because the truth was undeniable. More animals meant more warmth. The colder the night, the closer the cows, and certain creatures earned VIP status. Cows got pride of place near the family, giant, docile furnaces of body heat. Goats followed because, well, goats will always find a way inside. Chickens roosted in rafters and baskets, occasionally attempting surprise landings on unsuspecting heads. And pigs? Pigs did whatever pigs wanted, usually in the middle of the floor. Sure, there were risks. A chicken might decide your scalp is the perfect roost at 3 a.m., or you might step into something deeply regrettable before sunrise. But that was the trade-off, and while the livestock helped, peasants had to do their own share of insulation too. Namely, with the one fashion trend that never went out of style. Wear everything you own, all at once. There were no runways in medieval villages, unless you count the muddy path between the dung heap and the well. Clothes weren't about aesthetics. They were armor against the cold. Start with a linen undershirt that hadn't seen soap in a suspiciously long time. Over that, a wool tunic. Then maybe another, and a cloak. And if you were blessed by the wool gods, a patchy sheepskin tossed over your shoulders like you just won the world's itchiest tournament. Leggings sagged. Belts were tied with whatever string you had. Scarves were often just long rags pretending to be fancy. And footwear? If you had boots, great. You were basically royalty. Most peasants just wrapped their feet in scraps of cloth, stuffed them into wooden clogs, and hoped for the best. If your toes still worked by morning, it was considered a win. Because in the icy war of medieval winter, it didn't matter how you looked. What mattered was waking up slightly less frozen than you were the night before. And forget about washing all those layers. Doing laundry in winter meant dragging your clothes to a frozen stream, hacking through a crust of ice, and praying you didn't drop your only shirt into the current. If you were lucky, it would dry in a couple of days. If you were unlucky, you just created the world's saddest frozen shirt sculpture. Most peasants wisely opted for the smoke, sweat, and sheep signature scent. It wasn't exactly Chanel No. 5, but it beat freezing to death in a damp tunic. Strangely enough, all that grime had a hidden perk: insulation. That crusty, crunchy, grease-glazed outer shell. It trapped heat. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of Gore-Tex, just itchier, smellier, and completely socially unacceptable by modern standards. Dirt didn't just cling to you, it protected you. It was survival by stink. Hats, scarves, and gloves weren't accessories, they were lifelines. A wool cap could mean the difference between waking up cold or waking up frozen to your pillow. Gloves were cobbled together from whatever was lying around. Old fabric scraps, cracked leather, a dream. They rarely matched, and often looked like puppets that had seen too much. But they worked. Children didn't escape the fashion horror either. They were bundled so thoroughly they resembled overstuffed vegetables, little waddling turnips with scarves for arms. Forget running. Walking across the room required serious planning and 3 attempts to stand up. Style? Elegance? Never heard of them. Warmth was the real flex. The more shapeless and filthy your silhouette, the more likely you were to survive the night. So next time you groan about layering up for a frosty morning, just remember, medieval peasants walked around wearing their entire wardrobe at once, looked like lumpy scarecrows, and were grateful for it. In the medieval peasant playbook, dirt wasn't a nuisance. It was tactical. It wasn't a sign you'd given up. It was a carefully cultivated crust of survival. Getting grimy was less a hygiene failure and more a weatherproofing technique. Because here's the thing, freshly washed linen? Useless. It breathed, sure, but in the middle of winter, you didn't want breathability. You wanted armor, and dirt delivered. As peasants slogged through their days, their clothes accumulated a lovely cocktail of mud, sweat, soot, and natural oils. Over time, this filth clogged the gaps in fabric and turned breezy garments into wind-resistant shields. You didn't wear your cloak, you grew into it. Yes, you smelled like a goat that lost a bet, but guess what? You were warm. And in that eternal trade-off, comfort versus survival, warmth always won. Some folks even believed washing during winter could make you sick. Strip away your sacred filth layer, and the cold would sneak in like a tax collector with frostbite. So peasants kept their dirt armor intact. Baths were rare, laundry was rarer, and soap? That was for truly special occasions, like a bishop's visit or your own funeral. Adding to the strategy, peasants didn't change their clothes so much as layer them into legend. You didn't take off last month's shirt, you just threw a new tunic over it and called it progress. Eventually, you became a walking scrapbook of the past 6 weeks. Every stain told a story. That time you slipped in the mud and lived, or when a goat sneezed on you and you simply carried on. To outsiders, peasants may have looked and smelled like hygiene was a myth, but peasants knew better. That crusty tunic wasn't failure, it was armor, a thermal barrier against death by frostbite. You didn't smell like flowers, but you also didn't wake up with your toes frozen off. Priorities. Besides, in a world where everyone stank to high heaven, nobody noticed. Nose blindness wasn't a side effect. It was a survival skill. So yes, in medieval winters, filth wasn't a flaw. It was fashion. It was function. And if your outer layer could stand up on its own by February, congratulations, you were winning. Now, if you're picturing medieval peasants tucked into plush feather beds under embroidered quilts, allow us to ruin that fantasy real quick. The average peasant bed was more DIY disaster than rustic comfort. If you were lucky, you had a rough wooden frame. If not, you just flung a sack of straw on the floor and hoped nothing bit you. No memory foam, no springs, just a crunchy, lumpy mass that smelled faintly of barnyard and broken dreams. Turning over at night brought the soothing sounds of crinkling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a stork that clearly had a vendetta. Some skipped the frame entirely and embraced the earth-connected lifestyle, which is a nice way of saying they slept directly on the dirt. Influencers today would sell it as holistic. Back then, it was just Tuesday. Straw mattresses were temporary at best. Over time, they flattened, molded, invited bugs, and started growing their own ecosystem. Changing out the bedding was a major event, done maybe once a season, or when it started crawling. Rushes were a popular alternative. Long grasses spread across the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary, to battle the eau de livestock that permeated every surface. Fresh rushes smelled nice for about 12 hours. After that, they became one with the household grime, a mulch of food scraps, dirt, and questionable mysteries. And then there were the bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and other charming little horrors adored straw bedding. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations. You were living your most authentic medieval life. Still, as humble and gross as they were, these makeshift beds mattered. Straw acted as insulation from the frozen ground. And when your whole family, plus livestock, piled on top, it created precious pockets of body heat. The original space heater, powered by snoring and mutual desperation. So the next time you flop into your clean, soft, posture-correcting mattress, remember, somewhere in history, a peasant is watching you from beyond the grave, wrapped in 6 layers of filth, grinning with 3 teeth and muttering, "Must be nice." When you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and sheer optimism, winter breezes aren't just a nuisance, they're personal. Medieval peasants didn't just battle the cold outside, they waged war against the icy fingers creeping through their walls. Their weapon of choice? Whatever could be crammed into a crack. And there were a lot of cracks. Walls warped, mud crumbled, thatch sagged. Cold air found new and creative ways to sneak in every night, like a petty ghost with a vendetta. So sealing the house wasn't maintenance, it was survival. Peasants stuffed gaps with moss, straw, scraps of cloth, dry grass, and even animal hair. If it was vaguely squishy and looked like it might slow down a breeze, it was shoved into a hole. Some folks even slapped extra layers of mud and dung onto their walls each winter, turning house repair into a hands-on mud spa with zero glamour. Picture it. You're standing in freezing temperatures, smearing cold manure onto your own house while muttering, "This is fine, this is peak luxury." And in a weird way, it was. Roof leaks? Oh, absolutely. Thatched roofs were cheap and common, but waterproof? Only in theory. Holes were patched with rags, reeds, or in moments of pure desperation, turf stolen from the neighbour's field. Over time, your home started to resemble a sad quilt, sewn by someone who ran out of thread and hope. Doors and windows, if you had them, were more suggestion than barrier. A wooden plank hanging on rusty nails was considered high security. Windows, more like holes, were covered with animal hides or cloth soaked in animal fat to block the wind. Bonus, your living room now smelled faintly like jerky. Every night was a showdown between ingenuity and the relentless sneakiness of cold. 1 minute you were half warm, the next, a draft would slap you awake like an icy hand of doom. But medieval peasants? They were stubborn, resourceful, and used to a life where slightly frozen was just baseline. They patched, they stuffed, they slapped on mud and hoped for the best. And somehow, against all odds, they made it through. One dung-daubed, goat-scented winter at a time. Even the common folk had begun to murmur behind closed doors, calling her the Great Whore. They blamed her for the break with Rome, for the harsh reforms, for the uneasy air that now clung to England like smoke. The tide was turning, and then came Jane Seymour. Where Anne had once captivated Henry with wit and fire, Jane soothed him with silence and softness. And as Anne's star dimmed, Jane's began to rise. Anne saw it. She felt it. Desperation crept in. She poured affection onto the king, promised sons, begged for time. But Henry, restless, spoiled, hungry for novelty, was already picturing life beyond the woman he had once shattered a kingdom to possess. Her enemies moved in. Thomas Cromwell, once her staunch ally, now scented danger in Anne's defiance. Their alliance had been forged in ambition, but that fire had cooled. She pushed for reforms to help the poor and rein in the greedy. Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, wanted peace, power, and a docile queen who wouldn't meddle. Whispers spread like wildfire. Rumours twisted into accusations. Behind velvet curtains and polished smiles, knives were drawn, not of steel, but of words and secrets. Anne, the woman who had risen so boldly, who had rewritten the rules of power and passion, was suddenly the outsider at her own court. Her charm, once magnetic, now grated. The courtiers yearned for a queen who smiled, but stayed silent. And Jane waited, demure and calculating, just beyond the spotlight. It was Cromwell who made the first move. He knew Henry wanted out, but not another scandalous divorce. What the king needed was something cleaner, or dirtier, depending on your point of view. Disgrace would do what divorce could not, make Anne the villain, not the victim. The charges were breathtaking in their cruelty: adultery, incest, treason. Anne Boleyn, who had changed the world, was now accused of trying to destroy it. Her own brother arrested, her friends imprisoned, testimonies twisted under torture, glances and flirtations warped into evidence of treachery. It didn't need to be true. It just needed to be enough. Anne had played the game of power and passion better than anyone. But in Henry's court, the game never ended. And when it turned against you, it was merciless. The queen who had unseated a queen, who had broken a kingdom's spine to wear the crown, was about to learn how quickly a crown could crush. But in Henry's court, truth was a weapon, and the king wielded it as he pleased. Anne, sensing the noose tightening around her, fought with everything she had. She pleaded, not just for her life, but for his memory, of passion, of promise, of the kingdom they'd reshape together. It didn't matter. The man who once shattered a church to claim her now couldn't even meet her eyes. In May of 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, the great gates grown shut behind her with finality. In that moment, she understood. She was no longer queen. She was a prisoner, a scapegoat, a symbol to be broken. The game she'd once mastered was now closing in, ruthless and cold. Alone in the tower, Anne waited, for justice or for judgment. When she was finally brought before her tribunal in the tower's great hall, she stood tall. Facing a room of nobles whose power had risen with hers, she now saw only cold calculation in their eyes. They had come to erase her. The charges were monstrous. Adultery, with multiple men. Incest, with her own brother, George. High treason, a conspiracy to kill the king. In another time, such accusations against a queen would have been unthinkable. But this wasn't about truth. This was theatre. A performance staged to give Henry what he craved. Freedom, and a public reason to sever the crown he had once placed on Anne's head. Anne stood her ground. She denied every accusation, not with hysteria, but with fierce intelligence, sharp clarity, and a poise that silenced the room. She reminded them all that she had been anointed with sacred oil, chosen by divine will, crowned not by whim, but by right. She spoke of her loyalty, her sacrifices, the love she had poured into both crown and country, but none of it mattered. The outcome had been written long before she walked into that chamber. The trial was a farce, a spectacle. Witness after witness paraded forth, some bribed, others tortured, all bearing contradictions and flimsy claims. Evidence was sparse, logic was absent, but truth had no place here. Anne was declared guilty. Her brother George and the other accused men were sentenced alongside her, all condemned, all silenced. Anne, Queen of England, would die by the sword. A mercy, they said. A cleaner death than the gruesome traitor's fate she might have met. When the verdict was read, Anne did not weep. She didn't scream. She stood, as she always had, proud, composed, defiant. Even in her ruin, she remained a queen. She stood tall, her face pale, but her spirit unbroken. In those final moments before being led back to her cell, Anne's voice rang clear through the chamber. She said she was ready to die. She asked God for mercy, not just for herself, but for England. Anne defended herself with the same fire that had once won Henry's heart. She denied every accusation with intelligence, precision, and an unwavering composure that astonished even her enemies. She reminded them that she had been crowned with sacred oil, chosen by God, and anointed as Queen of England. She reminded them of her loyalty, her sacrifices, her love. But it was all for nothing. The verdict had been decided long before Anne set foot in the courtroom. The trial was a spectacle for the court and for the people, a public unmaking of a once unbreakable woman. Witness after witness, many coerced or bribed, spoke damning words. Dates and places contradicted each other. Evidence was flimsy, when it existed at all. But the truth was irrelevant now. Anne was found guilty. Her brother George and the other men accused with her were sentenced to death as well. Anne would be executed by beheading, a merciful sentence compared to the usual traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering. When the verdict was read, Anne did not break. She stood tall, her face pale but her spirit fiercely intact. In those final moments before being led back to her cell, she spoke clearly, declaring that she was prepared to die, and prayed that God would have mercy on her soul. As the heavy doors of the hall closed behind her, the court exhaled in relief. The storm Anne had been, brilliant, dangerous, unforgettable, was nearly over. But even then, they did not understand. They were not erasing Anne Boleyn. They were immortalizing her, in betrayal, in tragedy, and in legend. After her trial, Anne Boleyn was returned to the Tower of London, not as the triumphant queen who had once commanded England, but as a condemned prisoner awaiting death. Yet even facing the end, Anne refused to crumble. In the cold, echoing halls of the tower, Anne prepared herself. She spent hours in prayer, kneeling on the hard stone floors, her hands clasped tightly, her voice steady. She confessed to no crimes because she believed she had committed none. She was not afraid to die, she said, but she prayed that her death would bring peace to the kingdom, and perhaps mercy to her little daughter, Elizabeth. Her ladies-in-waiting, those few who had stayed loyal, wept in private. Anne comforted them instead of the other way around. She joked bitterly at times that she would be remembered as a queen who had lost her head. In her dark humour was the stubborn spark that had made her unforgettable. Henry VIII, meanwhile, showed no sign of mercy. He had already turned his attention to Jane Seymour. Even before Anne's execution date was finalised, Henry was arranging his next marriage. For Anne, this final betrayal, from the man who had once torn down a kingdom for her, must have been the deepest cut. On May 18th, 1536, Anne was told she would die the next morning. She slept little that night. Instead, she spent her final hours in prayer, asking God for forgiveness for all who had wronged her, and perhaps for herself, for the ambition and pride that had led her here. Henry, with a flicker of royal kindness, had arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution, faster, cleaner, less brutal than an axe. It was a small mercy, bought perhaps more for the king's conscience than for Anne's comfort. At dawn, Anne dressed carefully for her final moment. A dark grey gown of damask trimmed with fur, a crimson kirtle beneath, colours of dignity, of sacrifice. She pinned up her dark hair and tucked it beneath a simple cap, ready to face the blade with grace. As the tower's cold morning mist curled around the courtyard stones, Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, survivor, fighter, stepped forward. There would be no tears, no pleas, only a final act of courage in the face of history's judgment. Her end was near, but her story was just beginning. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold built within the Tower of London's walls. A small crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, all wrapped in silence, as if even the stone walls held their breath. Anne stood tall, her grey gown fluttering slightly in the cold morning breeze. She looked thinner than she had at court, her face pale but calm. There were no hysterics, no broken sobs. If anything, she faced death with the same fierce dignity that had once shaken a kingdom to its knees. She spoke briefly, carefully choosing her final words. She did not accuse. She did not defend herself. She prayed for the king's health and prosperity, the very man who had abandoned her. In those final moments, Anne offered the world not a confession, but forgiveness. Her courage stunned even those who had come to see her fall. The French executioner, brought specially to ensure a swift death, stepped forward. Anne knelt upright, her hands folded in prayer, her eyes lifted toward the heavens. A small white cloth was tied around her eyes. She remained still. The sword flashed once, silent, swift, and Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, history maker, was no more. She was buried quickly in an unmarked grave within the tower grounds, laid to rest in a narrow chest because no proper coffin had been prepared for her. A queen once crowned in gold, now left to vanish without ceremony. Yet Anne's story didn't end in that cold grave. Her daughter, Elizabeth, the child whose birth had once disappointed a king, would rise to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose reign would see the flowering of English art, power, and global influence. A queen who inherited her mother's fierce spirit, sharp mind, and unyielding resilience. Anne Boleyn changed the course of England forever. Her ambition helped trigger the break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. Her fall showed the world that even queens could be cast aside. Yet through her blood, through Elizabeth, Anne's legacy blazed brighter than any crown she had worn in life. In the end, Anne Boleyn won a kind of immortality, not through her survival, but through her indelible impact on history. By the early 1770s, the American colonies simmered like a pot left too long over a roaring fire. The relationship with Britain, once seen as the proud mother country, had soured into resentment, suspicion, and growing fury. It hadn't started with tea. Years earlier, the Stamp Act had enraged colonists by placing taxes on everything from newspapers to playing cards. That was followed by the Townshend Acts, taxing essentials like paper, glass, and paint. Each new law, passed thousands of miles away by a parliament in which the colonists had no representation, was like another spark landing in dry brush. At first, the anger showed itself in polite petitions and fiery pamphlets. Colonial assemblies drafted formal protests. Merchants organized boycotts. Writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson filled newspapers with passionate arguments about liberty and rights. But as time wore on, frustration deepened into something darker. A slow realization that Britain wasn't listening. Worse, Britain didn't care. Many colonists clung to the hope that if they just made enough noise, if they just reasoned hard enough, Parliament would repeal the taxes. And sometimes they did. The Stamp Act was famously repealed after loud colonial protest. But every small victory was followed by new legislation, new taxes, new insults. It wasn't about the money. It never really was. The taxes themselves were modest by British standards. What infuriated the colonists was the principle. They were being taxed without consent, treated as subjects rather than citizens, ruled like distant possessions rather than partners. Boston, more than any other city, became the beating heart of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a secretive, fiery group of patriots, grew louder and bolder. In 1770, tensions exploded into violence when British soldiers fired on unarmed civilians in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Blood had already stained the cobblestones. Trust was a thing of the past. By 1773, the colonies were teetering on the edge. A final insult would tip them into open defiance. And it came, not in the form of soldiers or new laws or armies, but in the quiet, seemingly harmless shape of crates stacked with tea. The colonists didn't know it yet, but the night that tea floated in the cold waters of Boston Harbor, the world would change forever. In 1773, Parliament made a critical miscalculation. Believing the American colonies would quietly accept cheaper tea, they passed the Tea Act, a law that was supposed to save the struggling British East India Company and, incidentally, reassert Britain's right to tax the colonies. On paper, it looked like a good deal. The Tea Act allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out the middlemen, slashing prices, and offering a luxury product at a bargain. A few pennies cheaper. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. Because the problem wasn't the price of tea, it was the principle behind it. The Tea Act left the hated tax on tea firmly in place. Accepting the tea, even at a discount, would mean acknowledging Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. To many Americans, that was unthinkable, a surrender of the liberties they had fought to protect for more than a decade. The news of the Tea Act spread like wildfire through the colonies. Merchants fumed. They saw their livelihoods threatened by a monopoly that would crush local trade. Patriots raged at the hidden message. The Crown still believed it could do whatever it pleased. In Boston, the reaction was especially fierce. Already a city scarred by the Boston Massacre and years of economic hardship, Bostonians recognized the Tea Act for what it was, a trap disguised as a bargain. Refusing the tea became a matter of honor, a litmus test for loyalty to the cause of liberty. Public meetings swelled. Newspaper columns burned with fiery rhetoric. Groups like the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and others, organized boycotts, vowing that no East India Company tea would be unloaded, sold, or drunk on American soil. All across the colonies, ships carrying the controversial tea were turned away by local resistance. In ports from New York to Charleston, the message was clear. We will not be bought. But in Boston, fate twisted differently. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrived, anchored in the harbour, and sat there, refusing to leave. Royal officials insisted the tea be unloaded. The colonists refused. A deadlock grew, taut as a drawn bowstring. The tension was unbearable. A single act would break it, and history would never be the same again. As the British tea ships sat stubbornly anchored in Boston Harbour, the city itself transformed into a powder keg. Every day that passed without resolution tightened the tension. Boston wasn't just resisting, it was preparing for a fight. In taverns, churches, and public squares, angry colonists debated what to do. The Sons of Liberty, led by fiery voices like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, moved swiftly to organize resistance. They posted public notices calling on citizens to boycott British tea and held raucous meetings that swelled with farmers, artisans, and merchants alike. Each gathering added fuel to the fire. The Old South Meeting House became the nerve center of the resistance. Thousands crammed into the wooden hall, their breath fogging the air, their voices rising in defiance. Here, resolutions were passed, speeches were made, and tempers boiled. Each vote against the unloading of tea was another hammer blow against British authority. But while the people of Boston stood united, the clock was ticking. British law demanded that imported goods, like tea, be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days. If the ships remained after the deadline, customs officials would seize the cargo and the tax would be collected by force. The Sons of Liberty understood that once the tax was paid, even under protest, the principle would be lost. It wasn't just about the tea anymore. It was about whether the colonies would accept being treated as subjects without rights, or whether they would stand and fight for their future. Meanwhile, the Royal Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, dug in his heels. He refused to let the tea ships leave without unloading their cargo, demanding that the law be obeyed, colonial outrage be damned. To him, backing down meant admitting that mobs, not monarchs, ruled the colonies. Boston's standoff became a spectacle. Every man, woman, and child knew that something was coming. You could feel it in the air, that cold, sharp sense before a storm when the world holds its breath. All it would take was one spark to ignite an explosion. And somewhere among the crowded streets and crowded hearts of Boston, a decision was quietly taking shape, a plan that would echo across oceans and empires. December 16th, 1773, dawned grey and cold over Boston, a city balanced on the edge of history. For nearly 3 weeks, the tea ships had sat in the harbour like ticking bombs. Now, the final deadline had arrived. According to British law, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival. If it wasn't, customs officials could seize the cargo, and British troops could be called in to enforce the law. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew what was at stake. If the tea came ashore, the principle was lost. If the colonists allowed it, even once, their cause, their claim to rights and liberty, would unravel. That morning, thousands of Bostonians and nearby colonists packed into the Old South Meeting House, the largest building in town. Some had walked miles through the icy countryside to be there. The meeting was so packed that men spilled out into the streets, straining to hear the fiery speeches echoing through the halls. Samuel Adams, the iron voice of rebellion, presided over the gathering. Speaker after speaker rose to denounce the Tea Act, to cry out against tyranny, to urge immediate action. But even among the defiants, uncertainty hung heavy. What could be done without sparking outright war? How could they stop the tea without opening the floodgates to brutal retaliation? As the afternoon wore on, riders galloped in with grim news. Governor Thomas Hutchinson remained unmoved. The ships would not be allowed to leave without unloading. The tea would be seized, the tax collected, the king's law enforced. The crowd buzzed with fury. The walls of the meeting house seemed to shudder with the force of it. Yet Samuel Adams stood calmly and spoke the words that signalled the end of debate. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. a simple sentence. But everyone knew what it meant. There would be no more petitions, no more compromises. Action would be taken. Outside, a war whoop cut through the gathering gloom, the signal. Men disguised themselves quickly, smearing soot on their faces, donning blankets and feathers in crude imitation of Mohawk warriors. It wasn't about fooling anyone. It was about creating a symbol, a message no one could mistake. The deadline had passed. Boston would answer not with words, but with defiance. As twilight deepened over Boston on December 16, 1773, the quiet streets began to stir. Figures moved through the shadows. Ordinary men cloaked in rough blankets, their faces blackened with soot, some adorned with feathers. They weren't trying to fool anyone into believing they were real Mohawks. Their disguise was symbolic, an act of shedding their old identities, of taking a stand as something new, something fierce. By the dozens, they made their way to Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay anchored. The harbour water churned cold and dark beneath them, thick with the sharp bite of winter air. There was no shouting, no drunken chaos. This was not a riot. It was a mission, carried out with calm, ruthless precision. Armed with hatchets and clubs, the disguised colonists swarmed the ships, overwhelming the few crew members still aboard. No harm came to the sailors. They were pushed aside, watched in silence as the operation began. Men split open the wooden chests with practiced blows, the fragrant smell of fresh tea spilling into the cold night air. Others heaved the crates overboard, their heavy splashes echoing across the still waters of the harbour. Chest after chest, 342 in total, was broken and dumped, until the black water swirled with thousands of pounds of tea leaves. Spectators watched from the wharf, silent, awed. British guards stationed nearby made no move to intervene. Whether from confusion, sympathy, or fear of escalating violence remains unclear. Some accounts suggest that even among British loyalists there was an understanding. Something had shifted, and there would be no stopping it tonight. The discipline was extraordinary. No cargo was stolen. No one raided the ships for valuables. Only the tea, the hated symbol of British oppression, was targeted. In a town where hunger and hardship were daily realities, the men could have easily turned the protest into an excuse for looting. They did not. When it was over, the harbour resembled a great, swirling cauldron, filled with torn chests and soaking tea leaves. The smell of the sea mixed with the sharp tang of smashed tea, filling the night air with a strange, bittersweet scent. The work was done. Silently, the men disappeared into the night, vanishing into the alleys and back streets of Boston. They left behind no names, no leaders, no claims to fame, only the unmistakable mark of revolution. As the last broken crates bobbed in the dark water, Boston stood still, almost holding its breath. The Boston Tea Party wasn't a riot, a brawl, or a drunken spectacle. It was something far rarer, an act of cold, deliberate defiance carried out under the cloak of night. The harbour was transformed into a giant, swirling teapot. Thousands of pounds of East India Company tea floated in great mats on the water, staining it black. Some colonists, curious and rebellious, scooped handfuls of soaked leaves from the harbour, only to be chastised by the Sons of Liberty patrolling the docks. Nothing was to be salvaged. No one would profit from this night's work. This was principle, pure and simple. The town woke the next morning to the smell of salty tea hanging heavy in the air. News spread like wildfire. Word of mouth, letters, broadsheets. By midday, everyone from apprentices to merchants knew what had happened, and opinions split fast. Among patriots, there was pride, a fierce, swelling pride that ordinary men had stood up to the mightiest empire in the world and struck a blow for liberty. Among loyalists and moderates, there was horror. To them, the destruction of property was reckless, dangerous. Had the colonies crossed a line they couldn't walk back from? Governor Thomas Hutchinson raged in his mansion, furious not only at the destruction but at the message it sent. If the king's authority could be defied so brazenly in Boston, where else might rebellion spark? British officials were stunned. They had expected protests, boycotts, maybe another riot like those that had broken out over the Stamp Act. They hadn't expected organised, disciplined revolutionaries to calmly destroy tens of thousands of pounds of royal property without so much as breaking a window. The ship's captains, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver, could only watch helplessly as their cargo disappeared beneath the waves. In the official ledgers, the night's loss would be tallied at over 10,000 British pounds, a fortune. But the real loss wasn't measured in pounds sterling or ruined tea. It was measured in trust, in loyalty, in the fragile illusion that Britain still ruled her colonies with consent. The night the tea sank, something deeper rose to the surface, a shared undeniable truth. The age of peaceful protest was ending, a reckoning was coming, and Boston was ready. When word of the Boston Tea Party crossed the Atlantic and reached London, the reaction was swift and furious. To British officials, it was not simply a protest, it was rebellion, an open, mocking challenge to royal authority that could not be ignored. King George III, upon hearing the news, was said to have grown cold with anger. Parliament, already frustrated by years of colonial disobedience, exploded in outrage. They demanded punishment, not just for the city of Boston, but as a warning to all the American colonies. The result was a series of laws so harsh they were quickly nicknamed the Intolerable Acts in America. The first blow came swiftly, the Boston Port Act. In one brutal stroke, Parliament ordered the closure of Boston's bustling harbour, the economic lifeline of the city, until the destroyed tea was paid for and order restored.